Nintendo has finally announced the OLED Switch, which is something we've been hearing about for months now. But it's not quite the Switch Pro. And honestly, I think that's fine. This new model has a 7-inch OLED screen instead of the 6.2-inch LCD from before. It has 64 gigabytes of onboard storage instead of 32 gigabytes. That's a lot more useful. And it's gonna be $350, so that's $50 more than before as well, and $150 more than the Switch Lite. And all that together, sounds like a pretty noticeable bump, but there is no 4K support at all. And that's something rumors have been speculating, honestly, for the past year. We've been hearing that, when it's docked, a potential new Switch model will upscale content to 4K. We've been hearing about DLSS, which is NVIDIA's upscaling technology, which uses AI processing to take lower resolution textures and output them at a higher resolution, and honestly it looks pretty good from what we've seen with PC games. But there is none of that, which is probably going to be a really contentious thing for a lot of Nintendo fans. I'll get to more on why 4K probably didn't happen this time around, but let's talk about some of the other new elements of this new model. It'll be released on October 8th, which is the same day Metroid Dread is going to be released, so that's probably a nice bundle there for a lot of people. It has a full stand on the back, kind of a wider stand that looks very similar to Microsoft's Surface tablets. Honestly, this is probably the way it should have been from the beginning, because the original Switch's skinny little stand could barely keep that thing up even on a completely flat surface where nothing was moving, let alone trying to take that on a plane or train or car or something. And as you can see just by looking at footage of this new machine, that bigger screen means there's less screen bezel around everything, which just makes this new one look a lot more modern, which I kind of appreciate. Nintendo says this new model also has enhanced audio. We have no idea what that means. It could mean bigger speakers, it could mean different speakers and a different DSP. I'm just hoping for bigger sound when you're outside. And another thing that's pretty notable is that this model is going to have a new dock that has a built-in Ethernet port. And that's going to be a big deal for people who play a lot of multiplayer games. I believe in the past you were able to just plug in USB stick with Ethernet, but this is just much more convenient. And the good thing about that dock is that it's also backwards compatible with older Switches, so you won't have to buy a whole new console if you really just want Ethernet. The OLED screen is also going to be a really nice addition just because I think the screen was the weakest part of the original Switch. When I reviewed it, I had a lot of trouble playing games outdoors. It just wasn't bright enough. Sun glare would be a big issue. OLED fixes a bit of that. It's a more vibrant screen technology, so colors will pop a bit more, contrast will be better. OLED doesn't have as much peak brightness, but that brightness in the original Switch LCD wasn't that high to begin with, so it's going to be interesting to see how they compare, but I'm just really looking forward to it. I really want to play Breath of the Wild with an OLED screen, just like I am when my Switch is docked. And as you can see, this new model also has a new color scheme for the Switch. It's black and white with a white dock, and the red and blue model is still going to be around as well. So yeah, there's a lot of new stuff here, but the lack of 4K is kind of a bummer, just because it's been a while since the original Switch was released, and it would be nice to have some sort of 4K upscaling. But here's the thing, folks. This is Nintendo, and Nintendo is a company that has never really been about pursuing specs or anything like that. According to some of the rumors we've been hearing, Nintendo was considering using a newer Tegra system on a chip that would have some of NVIDIA's newer technology, especially DLSS. And that's just not happening here, and who knows why that didn't happen. A lot of tea leaf reading that goes on with reporting on upcoming devices. This happens with Apple products too. Sometimes two devices ends up becoming one by the time a company releases it, or sometimes we hear about features that'll be coming next year. I definitely would put money on Nintendo having a 4K Switch of some kind in the works, but it's just not the time this year, unfortunately. I think to truly do 4K like the way maybe we were hearing in those reports, Nintendo would also need to change a lot more about the Switch. First of all, it would need a new Tegra SoC, which could be a problem because the chip shortage right now globally means that it's been tough for AMD and NVIDIA and Microsoft and Sony to get all the hardware they need to actually, produce their systems and their graphics cards. So that's certainly an issue. Nintendo's been building Switches for years now, and in 2019 they even gave the original Switch the slightly upgraded, more efficient Tegra chip, which gave it up to 9 hours of battery life. That's the same one in the Switch Lite. So clearly there have been some upgrades down the line, but a big leap towards something that could do DLSS may have been just too tough to accomplish this year. Just judging from the reporting we've seen, there was the potential for a future Switch to do 4K upscaling from 1080p textures when it's docked, but even to fit 1080p textures into a game, you'd probably need more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. So a future Switch would have to have 6 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes even to really make that work. And despite what you're hearing about 4K gaming, it's going to be really tough for any future Switch to support native rendering of 4K, even when it's docked. That's something that's been really difficult even for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X to accomplish at certain points. So it's really very smart upscaling. That's the thing to look forward to. And honestly, that's just a way to make games look better on bigger TVs, when they're actually being produced in 1080p. So yeah, it's a shame we're not seeing 4K this time around, but there was also, a lot of speculation about what brand new hardware would mean for the Switch and, the Switch library and market overall. It would mean developers would have to think about how they're, taking advantage of new hardware for some games, which is something that Nintendo has often struggled with when it's released new versions of existing systems like the new 3DS and the various XLs. So at least for now, in terms of overall broad compatibility, this is probably the smartest idea for them. And I think if you have the original Switch, that device is getting long in the tooth right now. If you didn't just jump on getting the refresh model with the better battery life, this is probably a good reason to jump over to something like this new Switch model. It is expensive though, and I do think that's going to be an issue for a lot of people. That is most of the way towards getting a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X, and that's going to be tough for Nintendo to justify. But again, there is the $200 Switch Lite. There are options out there for consumers. It's just a shame we didn't get the full upgrade that we were expecting. Nintendo also gave us a small warning that this new Switch may have issues with the Labo kits, just because the sizing and the screen size, and everything is just a little different from what Labo was meant to work with. According to Nintendo, this new Switch is 3 millimeters wider than before, but all the other dimensions are the same. It's also 23 grams heavier than before, which is not something you'd feel at all, but it's notable. And Labo was such a unique thing. It really involved very exacting specifications. So it makes sense why maybe that one would have some issues. Nintendo also says some games may perform differently because of this new screen size, so I'd be interested to see what those outliers are. So sure, folks, I get the disappointment. Would have been nice to have some 4K upscaling on the Switch. Ultimately, I do think that's something Nintendo's working on, and we'll probably hear more about that maybe next year or the following year even. There's honestly no big rush. The Switch is still selling really well. Developers have been able to do quite a lot with this hardware, and I don't think Nintendo's out there thinking about how they're gonna catch up to the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, because really, Microsoft and Sony have been trying to catch up to them. So really, Nintendo's just in a league of its own, and it could just do whatever it wants, for better or worse. That's sometimes bad news for Nintendo fans, because it means you're going to be paying a lot for upgrades that just don't really stack up to much compared to competitors. But I do think overall, this is going to be a nice upgrade for a lot of people, especially if you have the original Switch. And if you've been waiting on buying a Switch, this is certainly the one to get.